Yesterday, I met up with a really cool guy from my church named Steve, and I asked him a bit about rest because he's a really busy guy. And so we went over the theology of rest, just traced through the Bible. And so I want to start by talking about creation. So in creation, what kind of happens is that God does the work to create us, right? Whereas many other religions, they show work as something that's bad, that's dirty, that humans are subjected to, right? It's something that came out of Pandora's box along with poverty and disease, or it's something that the humans are cursed to do because the gods are too good to work, right? But in Christianity, we see that God gets down into the dirt, right? And he is working and he creates us. And so what happens is that after the 6 days of creation, after 6 days of God working, on day 7, he takes a step back to rest. And now God doesn't need to rest the same way that we do. So this is really important because what he's doing is he's inviting us in to commune with him. So we are invited into his rest, okay? And something that's very important to note is that between days 1 through 6, we see it repeated, and then there was evening and then there was morning. Well, it's saying that the whole day has passed. However, on day 7, and in the first few verses of Genesis 2, we see that God blesses the seventh day. He makes it holy, but it doesn't say that morning and evening passed. And now symbolically, this kind of shows that we are still in that day of rest. We are in the seventh day even now. We are still in the state where God's work has finished, and we are invited to commune with God as a part of creation. However, in Genesis 3, we see that after Adam and Eve choose to live life according to their own wisdom, the curse that we face is that we are now enslaved by our work, right? Adam's curse is that he is going to toil, and yet thorns and thistles are going to come out of the ground. And so this kind of shows that no matter how much we try to redeem ourselves or prove our own worth through our own work, right, through the work that we do according to our own wisdom, we cannot succeed. That's the curse of sin. It's the consequence that we face. And so as a result, even though we have been invited into God's rest, because of our own choices, we fall away from this rest, and this decreates us, right? We're further from what we were intended to do, from what God has intended us to be for. And so that's the whole creation section that we see over here. I kind of want to get into Sabbath. Now, the first time, or I believe it's the first time that the Sabbath is kind of mentioned, is in the Ten Commandments. And I believe it might show up somewhere in the other books of the Torah as well. But the verse that I took out was from Deuteronomy 5. And here it lays out the 10 commandments. And we see that the Sabbath is the fourth commandment. Now, why is this important? Okay, well, commandments 1 through 3 are about God, okay? We see that there is only one God, that we shall not bow down to other gods, and we shall not use the Lord's name in vain. Those are the first 3 commandments. However, commandments 5 through 10 are all about other people, right? You shall honor your father and mother, don't murder, adultery, lying, stealing, and coveting, right? In between these 2 sections, we have the Sabbath, right? It's this fourth commandment that bridges the laws between God and his people. And now, what's the importance of this, you might ask? Well, as we saw earlier, that the day of rest is for creation to commune with God. Here, we see how symbolically, the Sabbath is what bridges God and his people, right? This is the importance of rest. So, we also see the Sabbath mentioned in the New Testament, where Jesus performs his miracles. And if you count how many miracles he performs and how many were recorded to be done during the Sabbath, it's like disproportionately a lot of them were done on the Sabbath. And now why is this? Well, in Mark 2, we see that when Jesus was doing a bunch of miracles and the Pharisees were kind of upset, right? Jesus explains that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Actually, I think this was when Jesus' apostles were picking grain, right? They were trying to eat on the Sabbath. So what is the reason for this? Why does Jesus purposefully do so many miracles on the Sabbath, even though he knows that this is God's allotted day of rest? Now, if we take a look at the nature of Jesus' miracles, we see that a lot of them are restorative, right? They're very healing. He's healing people. The lame can walk, the blind can see. And they're not impressive or amazing miracles in the sense that he's not flying or shooting lasers out of his eyes, right? If he came down to try and make people believe in him, to prove that he's a god, why would he not be flying or shooting lasers? Why wouldn't he be smiting people who don't believe in him? We see that Jesus' miracles aren't of that sort. Instead, they're restorative. And the fact that they're restorative and a lot of them are done on the Sabbath kind of ties into the fact that the Sabbath is meant for God to restore and recreate us, right? It undoes this decreation that we see as a result of the curse over here. So the Sabbath brings us closer to God and makes us more like who he wants us to be. Okay, one more thing I wanted to tie in, just the parallels of how the gospel mirrors creation. Okay, we see that in step 1, God did the work to create us in the same way that when Jesus came down, he did the work to recreate us. And as a result of his work, we are invited into his rest. However, after creation, we've fallen away from rest due to our own choices, due to our desire to live according to our own wisdom, to sin by not living according to God's wisdom. And here we see that after Jesus has come, we're faced with this choice. In Hebrews 4, it describes the difference between someone who chooses to disobey God and fall apart from his rest versus someone who constantly strives to enter his rest. And so, as we are God's children who have been invited into his rest, right, it's still something that we must constantly strive for. It's something that takes work to enter rest, right? It's not easy. It needs to be deliberate. And the first step towards doing that is by honoring the Sabbath, is by setting apart that day to rest, right? Whether it's physically, mentally, spiritually, like all three, but it might happen at different times depending on how your schedule might be, right? If we choose to sin by disobeying this fourth commandment and not resting, the result is that we do not enter his rest. And so this section on the right leads to our decreation, whereas this section on the left leads to our recreation. Ultimately, these three things point towards God's intention for rest. Okay? Rest is for us to heal from the consequences of sin, as seen in Jesus' miracles. As seen in Genesis 3, the curse on Adam, it's also for us to heal from sin's consequences or the effects of sin on our work. Now, you might see that a lot in the workplace where there's broken relationships. You might see that a ton in ministry as well, right? The nature of our work, even when we're doing a good thing, offering good services, it's incredibly broken just because of the way that the world is. And God promises that as he recreates the world, when Jesus comes back, we will no longer have to suffer the consequences of sin and its effects on our work. But right now, this is something that we have to deal with. So God's intention for a rest on earth is for us to heal from this, right? It's for our recreation. And then the second intention for rest is for us to commune with God and let him restore us. And now these two things are very connected, right? Because for us to commune with God, we have to be made holy. And we let him restore us to heal. So God's intention for rest, right, is for us as a part of creation to commune with God and allowing him to restore and recreate us and bridge the gap between us and him. So this leads us to the application questions. I want you guys to think a little creatively. So the first application question is, how do you recover from the way sin has twisted our work? Whether it's physically or mentally or spiritually. So think a bit about what's making you tired. Think about the broken relationships that you might be facing, whether it's clickiness or toxicity or gossip and slandering. And think about how you can spiritually recover, right? Whether it's through quiet time or fellowship, worship and prayer, going on dates with a pastor or meeting up with someone in your church. All these things help us recover, and it might look different for each person, right? Someone might prefer to delve into art or engage in some solitude, whereas another person might choose to engage in fellowship or relationship, and that's how they find their rest. We've been given different gifts and different callings, And in the same way that these callings and gifts reflect in our work, they also reflect in how we rest. And so the second question is, how do you commune with God? When you're taking this rest, how are you being brought closer to God? Are you spending solitude praying? Or are you spending time with the people who can mentor you or people who you can pray for? Just how is this communion being done on your day of rest? And here I wrote down think creatively. And that's because there's many ways for you to live this out in your life. Perhaps you could be trying to meet up with a few friends over coffee to talk about your life's troubles and to pray together, right? That's something I really love doing. Or maybe you do this in solitude by engaging in arts, right? Whether it's a story or whether it's the fine arts or music and worship. And those are things that can bring you closer to God, that you can see God's beauty through. Obviously, worship and prayer and Bible reading, scripture reading, those are important too, right? And that's how you might find your rest when you go to scripture and read about something that's been troubling you, or when you're praying about something that's you've been facing at work, right? That is a part of spiritual rest. I'll include the PDF somewhere, and I hope that you guys can spend some time in prayer and seek out God's rest.